Good afternoon, everyone. It's Thursday, May 7th, 2020. I'm just going to wait a second. Get some of you guys in here. And also, I need your input about my audio. Is my audio okay, or does it sound like I'm Darth Vader again? Let me know in the chat if my audio is okay, or if I sound like Darth Vader again. It is a beautiful day. It is a beautiful, beautiful day. We're good. Okay. Very good. Firstly, I want to thank Noble Gold for sponsoring this video. A lot of things have changed during the lockdown. I don't miss driving with tons of traffic. I'm still talking to a lot of people virtually. I don't like Zoom all that much, to be honest. But if you've seen the returns on the stock market since the beginning of the year and the virus, it's clear that the old ways of doing things aren't really working, and the Fed has to prop up returns, pumping trillions of dollars into the system to try to avoid what looks like a collapse. You can't have 20% of unemployment, almost 30 million people, without massive fallout. You can't spend trillions bailing out businesses with no consequences. So we have to secure a way to guard our wealth, our savings, and our investments. Gold, silver, palladium, and platinum have proven to be safe haven investments. It's the only investment with appreciating value during an economic hardship or collapse. If you're interested in securing your wealth, call Noble Gold Investment at 877-646-5347. That's 877-646-5347, or go to noblegoldinvestments.com. Thank you, Noble Gold, for supporting the channel. Fantastic sponsor. And thanks, guys, for listening. I'm bringing in my audience on Periscope, DLive, and Facebook. And we're going to go through this stuff together today, guys. Very big day. Lots to talk about. I'm going to sit here. Hopefully, I feel like it's really important. We've got a 20-page filing here. If you have not heard, the government has filed almost a motion to dismiss the criminal information against General Michael T. Flynn with prejudice. I'm really, really glad that we have spent so much time on this channel, on the podcast, going through this case in a very detailed way so that all of you understand the implications and what's been going on. I love you guys too. It's Uncover DC on DLive. Thanks for joining me, everyone. We're going to walk through this filing, and I'm going to read it to you, and we're going to break it down. And I will link it below in the description box on YouTube as well. So again, a day of exoneration for General Flynn. Thank goodness justice is finally done. Finally done. An innocent man who was tortured by a corrupt, disgusting Department of Justice for almost 3 full years is now completely exonerated, and nobody will ever be able to bring this case back against him ever again for the history of time. It is a national day of prayer, as per Barbara Flynn, General Flynn's, or Barbara Redgate Flynn, I should say, General Flynn's sister. I am super, I found out when I was in the car on my way to an appointment, and I cried. And I cried because this is the beginning of a snowball. And just to give you an idea, before we go through the documents, I'm just going to show you what we've got going on here on lefty, horrible, traitorous Twitter. The DOJ has lost its way, but career people, please stay because America needs you. This country is hungry for honest, competent leadership. I said, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You shouldn't have the right to an attorney, as I've already afforded you more than you afforded an innocent man. You are a traitor. Because he is. Disgusting. Seeing them all, it's funny because, we're on Twitter a lot. This is where all the news happens. I spend my entire day on Twitter and now on CloutHub as well, by the way. And I'm on Twitter all day and I'm on CloutHub all day, and I'm seeing all of this stuff from the left and the Witnesses of the world that we talked about, and all of this coming up about how they said that he was a traitor, and just the disgusting way that they flouted this plea deal. This was a tool, a political weapon. That's all this was the entire time, okay? If you're having a problem with the stream, I don't think that this is my issue. Please refresh. But I want to get into this, and we can go over all the particulars afterwards, and I have a lot to say on this. So if you get bored, leave, come back later, whatever, but I need to get all this out. Let's read through this motion together. Government's motion to dismiss the criminal information against the defendant, Michael T. Flynn. The United States of America hereby moves to dismiss with prejudice the criminal information filed against Michael T. Flynn pursuant to Federal Rule of Criminal Procedure 48A. The government's determined, pursuant to the principles of federal prosecution and based on an extensive review and careful consideration of the circumstances, that continued prosecution of this case would not serve the interests of justice. Mr. Flynn entered a guilty plea, which he has since sought to withdraw, to a single count of making false statements in January 24th, 2007 interview with investigators of the FBI. This crime, however, requires, listen carefully, we talked about this the other day, a statement to be not simply false, but materially false with respect to a matter under investigation. Materiality is an essential element of the offense. Materiality, moreover, requires more than mere relevance or relatedness to the matter being investigated. It requires probative weight, where the statement is reasonably likely to influence the tribunal in making a determination required to be made. What this means in English is that if you lie to it, like the charge of lying to investigators that they're charging here, it needs to have some impact on something else that they're investigating. It needs to have some impact on something else they're attempting to, accomplish. In other words, they were able to get this on George Papadopoulos because they said he lied about where Mifsud was and when he talked to him. And because of that, they weren't able to get to Mifsud, who was material to their investigation. This here was nonsense. There was nothing material about whether or not General Flynn told these guys that he didn't remember one line in the call that he had with Ambassador Kislyak while executing his duties as an incoming administration official during the transition. So, after a considered review of all the facts and circumstances of this case, including newly discovered and disclosed information appended to the defendant's supplemental pleadings, the government has concluded that the interview of Mr. Flynn was untethered to and unjustified by the FBI's counterintelligence investigation into Mr. Flynn, a no longer justifiably predicated investigation that the FBI had, in the Bureau's own words, prepared to close because it had yielded a, quote, absence of any derogatory information. Again, we talked about this the other day. They ran a counterintelligence investigation into General Flynn. They found nothing. The only thing they had was a lie from Stefan Halper, who said that he was at a dinner with General Flynn, who hopped into a taxi with a Russian spy and honeypot named Svetlana Lokova, who we've interviewed several times on the podcast and was a Cambridge scholar, a brilliant woman who was there at a dinner to show her research. Ridiculous. Now, the government is not persuaded that the January 24th, 2017 interview was conducted with a legitimate investigative basis and therefore does not believe Mr. Flynn's statement were material, even if untrue. They just told you that they had no reason to go and interview him when they interviewed him. Moreover, we do not believe that the government can prove either the relevant false statements or their materiality beyond a reasonable doubt. In other words, if the judge were to grant the motion to revoke the plea or recall the plea, they wouldn't be able to prove this case in court. They would lose. And they're not allowed to bring they're under guidelines, they are not to bring a case forward that they do not think that they can win. A determination to prosecute represents a policy judgment that the fundamental interests of society require the application of federal criminal law to a particular set of circumstances. In the government's assessment, mindful of the high burden to prove every element of an offense beyond a reasonable doubt, and that, quote, government prosecutors have a duty to do justice, continued prosecution of the charged crime does not serve a substantial federal interest. the government respectfully moves to dismiss the criminal information with prejudice, meaning it can never be brought again against Mr. Flynn. The footnote here is important. This review not only included newly discovered and disclosed information, but also recently declassified information as well. Factual background. Very important. This is a timeline. Here we go. The FBI opened a counterintelligence investigation into Mr. Flynn on August 16, 2016, quote, as part of the larger Crossfire Hurricane umbrella investigation into the presidential campaign of Donald J. Trump and its possible coordination with Russian officials to interfere with the 2016 presidential election. Opening of the Crossfire Razor investigation, codenamed Crossfire Razor, the investigation's stated goal was, quote, was to determine whether Mr. Flynn was directed and controlled by and or coordinated activities with the Russian Federation in a manner which is a threat to the national security and or possibly a violation of the Foreign Agents Registration Act. We went over all of that stuff. In addition to the predication for opening Crossfire Hurricane, which did not specifically identify Mr. Flynn, the FBI predicated the counterintelligence investigation of him on an articulable factual basis that consisted of 3 facts. 1, Mr. Flynn's service as a foreign policy advisor to the Trump campaign, his publicly documented connection to the state-affiliated Russian entities, and the fact that he had traveled to Russia in December of 2015. My goodness. After approximately 4 months of investigation, however, the FBI, quote, determined that Mr. Flynn was no longer a viable candidate as part of the larger Crossfire Hurricane umbrella case and prepared to close the investigation. We saw this last week. We went over this stuff on the channel last week. The closing form. At some point prior to January 4th, 2017, the FBI drafted a closing communication to effect the termination of the case. This is an interview of Mary McCord from the FBI 302 that they have. This document noted the specific, quote, goal and predication for the investigation. It laid out the numerous searches of holdings and investigative steps that had each step yielded no derogatory information on Mr. Flynn. And I have said this and I'll say it again right now. General Flynn was clean as a whistle, never even snipped a mattress tag. He was so good of a person and so good of a, I don't even know how to explain this, that they had to literally create a fake crime in order to try and prosecute him. Think about this. They were searching for something using the full weight, might, and power of the Department of Justice and were so shocked they couldn't even find a single misstep, not one, in every last thing that they investigated, that they literally had to invent a crime. Ugh. It stated that the investigation had failed to produce, quote, any information on which to predicate further investigative efforts, with the highlight on further. And it noted that no interview of Mr. Flynn was required as part of the case closing procedure before concluding, quote, the FBI is closing this investigation. The document also stated if new information is identified or reported to the FBI regarding the activities of Crossfire Razor, the FBI will consider reopening the investigation if warranted. The document had not been approved, however, as of January 4th, 2017, meaning they didn't close it. And they're telling you they're assigning exhibits to all of this stuff. See example 7, FBI communications and link messages on these dates, 1/4, 123, 124, and 210. Before the intended case closing took effect, the FBI learned of communications between Mr. Flynn and Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak that had taken place in late December 2016, and which touched on matters of foreign policy. This, Tracy speaking, this is in response to the sanctions put on Russian diplomats by the Obama administration, which forced the incoming Trump administration to step in to kind of calm things down so that when they took office, they would have some sort of a level playing field to play on. Calm down, guys. That's what this was basically that General Flynn was doing. By this time, Mr. Flynn had already been named by President-elect Trump as his incoming national security advisor. The FBI had in their possession transcripts of the relevant calls Peter Strzok told them that on July 19th, 2017. Believing that the counterintelligence investigation of Mr. Flynn was to be closed, FBI leadership, quote, the seventh floor, determined to continue its investigation of Mr. Flynn on the basis of these calls and considered opening a new criminal investigation based solely on a potential violation of the Logan Act. Which, by the way, again, Tracy speaking, Rod Rosenstein tasked Robert Mueller with investigating when he put the scope memo out, which we got declassified yesterday. Yes, that's right. Rod Rosenstein tasked Robert Mueller to investigate General Flynn for a Logan Act violation. Yet, discussions with the Department of Justice resulted in the general view that the Logan Act would be difficult to prosecute. Sally Yates said so on September 7th, 2017. The FBI opened an independent criminal investigation. The FBI never opened an independent FBI criminal investigation. On January 4th, 2017, FBI Deputy Assistant Director Peter Strzok learned that Razor's closure had not been timely executed and the counterintelligence investigation into Mr. Flynn was unexpectedly still formally open. Mr. Strzok immediately relayed the serendipitously good news to Lisa Page, quote, the special counsel to FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe, remarking that, quote, our utter incompetence actually helps us. Ms. Page reacted with surprise and relief. Mr. Strzok, moreover, instructed agents to, quote, keep it open for now at the behest of the seventh floor. Mr. Strzok indicated there was a, quote, need to decide what to do with him. Other internal FBI messages from that afternoon reflect apparently related conversations about a potential interview. Peter Strzok, I believe, says, I heard, this is a Lisa Page text, I believe. I heard Pete say, Andy and blank will interview. Andy McCabe was supposed to interview General Flynn. That all changed around. As of January 4th, 2017, then, the FBI kept open its counterintelligence investigation into Mr. Flynn based solely on his calls with Kislyak, the only new information to arise since the FBI's determination to close the case. On January 12, 2017, the Washington Post reported the December 29th communications between Flynn and the Russian ambassador. The next day, on January 13th, Sean Spicer, the spokesperson for the Trump transition, clarified that the communications had involved only logistics, which seemed to contradict the nature of the calls. By the way, Ignatius got illegal information that was unmasked from the call with General Flynn and Kislyak. That's what we know as of now. That's the assumption. I am leaning towards a warrant that produced this call, but we'll see. We'll see. On January 15th, Vice President-elect Mike Pence stated in a news interview that Mr. Flynn had suggested that his conversation with Kislyak did not relate to sanctions. And around this time, FBI Director James Comey advised DOJ leadership of its investigation into Mr. Flynn, and senior officials at both the FBI and DOJ had concerns that the incumbent White House officials' descriptions of Mr. Flynn's calls with Kislyak weren't accurate. FBI Director Comey took the position that the FBI would not notify the incoming Trump administration of the Flynn-Kislyak communications. Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates and other senior DOJ officials took the contrary view and believed that the incoming administration should be notified. Yates and another senior DOJ official became frustrated when Director Comey's justifications for withholding the information from the Trump administration repeatedly morphed, vacillating from the potential compromise of a counterintelligence investigation to the protection of a purported criminal investigation. Let me just stop. Don't assign any nobility to James Comey for this, please, because he just wanted to keep it a secret for longer that they were looking at him. I would almost, again, speculating here, he wanted to keep this quiet for as long as possible so that they would have this over the administration for as long as possible, and that's the only reason. Comey had said something to the, this is a quote, Comey had said something to the effect of there being an ongoing criminal investigation. The Deputy Attorney General, DNI, and Director of the CIA all agreed that the FBI should notify the incoming Trump administration of what had actually been said on the calls. FBI Director Comey continued to refuse to brief the White House in a subsequent conversation with CIA Director John Brennan. On January 23, 2017, then Acting Attorney General Yates met with senior DOJ officials, and they again discussed the need to press the FBI to notify the White House. Matters came to a head on January 24th. That morning, Yates contacted Director Comey to demand that the FBI notify the White House of the communications. Director Comey did not initially return her call. This is all interesting. When Director Comey called her back later that day, he advised her that the FBI agents were already on their way to the White House to interview Mr. Flynn. Acting Attorney General Yates was flabbergasted and dumbfounded, and other senior DOJ officials hit the roof upon hearing of this development, given that an interview of Flynn should have been coordinated with the DOJ. In fact, in the preceding days, senior officials at the FBI had been engaged in discussions about how to approach Mr. Flynn and whom to notify. On January 21st, 2017, Mr. Strzok proposed to Bill Priestap, the FBI's counterintelligence chief, that Mr. Flynn should be given a defensive briefing about an investigation under the Crossfire Hurricane umbrella, or alternatively, an interview under light defensive briefing pretext. In other words, we're going to frame him. Mr. Strzok also noted the DOJ might direct us to inform Vice President or anyone else, speculating that this could lead to the White House specifically directing us not to speak with Mr. Flynn. On January 22nd, an FBI attorney emailed Mr. Strzok and Ms. Page that if we usually tell the White House, I think we should do what we normally do. Though the official also noted they could be told not to debrief or interview Razor. In advance of the interview, Director Comey determined that they would go interview Mr. Flynn the following day without notifying either the DOJ or the White House. In a December 2018 interview with MSNBC and NBC News analyst Nicole Wallace, here it is, folks. He stated his course of action was, quote, something we or I probably wouldn't have done or gotten away with in a more organized administration. See interview by Nicole Wallace with James Comey. Messages between Mr. Strzok and Ms. Page on January 23rd, 2017. I just have to stop. That's now memorialized in a court document, and I think that that's beautiful. Messages between Mr. Strzok and Ms. Page on January 23rd, 2017 indicated that Bill Priestap had conducted several conversations with Andy McCabe because he wanted to know why we had to go aggressively doing these things openly. This is Bill Priestap, who was, again, responsible for writing What is Our Goal? To get him to lie? To get him to admit to a Logan Act violation so he can be fired or referred to the DOJ? Deputy Director McCabe was, quote, frustrated and cut him off. Oh, on the morning of January 24th, follow-up messages between Strzok and Page indicated that Bill Priestap brought it up again, this time in front of Director Comey, and that Deputy Director McCabe was frustrated and cut him off. In any event, that morning, McCabe called Mr. Flynn to arrange the interview. Deputy Director Andrew McCabe, sorry guys, this is a little confusing to read because they're referencing exhibits. He explained that recent media statements about his contacts with Kislyak merited a sit-down and expressed the FBI's desire to accomplish the interview quickly, quietly, and as discreetly as possible. McCabe further advised that if Mr. Flynn wished to have anyone else at the meeting, including the White House counsel, the FBI would have to elevate the issue to DOJ. In other words, if you want to have people there to help defend you, we're going to have to move this up the ladder. So you might want to reconsider having your own damn attorney there when we try to frame you. Mr. Flynn himself, a former director of the DIA, stated that he readily expected that the FBI already knew the contents of his conversation with the ambassador, stating, quote, you listen to everything they say. Mr. Flynn then agreed to meet with the interviewing agents in his office no less than 2 hours later. He was unguarded in the interview and clearly viewed the agents as allies. There's a footnote. Priestap's notes dated January 24th state, what's our goal? Truth, admission, or to get him to lie so we can prosecute him or get him fired. On the same paper, Priestap wrote, quote, if we're seen as playing games, the White House will be furious. Protect our institution, which is the most important thing to these people, by not playing games. Another note stated, quote, we regularly show subjects evidence with the goal of getting them to admit their wrongdoing. I don't see how getting someone to admit their wrongdoing is going easy on them. Mr. Flynn was unguarded and clearly viewed them as allies. Mr. Strzok and the other agent said didn't show him transcripts of the calls, nor did the agents give at any point warnings that making false statements would be a crime. According to the FBI's recollections, when asked if Mr. Flynn recalled any conversation in which he encouraged Kislyak to not escalate the situation in its response to American sanctions, Mr. Flynn responded uncertainly, stating, quote, "Not really, I don't remember. It wasn't don't do anything." Mr. Flynn also stated that although it was possible, he didn't recall any conversation in which the ambassador stated that Russia would moderate its response due to Mr. Flynn's request. He stated he did not have a long conversation with Mr. Kislyak to don't do something. Thank you to everybody sending super chats and super hearts. I really appreciate them very much. Meanwhile, when asked if he recalled asking countries to take certain actions on the United Nations vote on Israeli settlements, Mr. Flynn explained that the conversations were, quote, along the lines of where do you stand and what's your position, and that, quote, he didn't believe his calls to the various countries would change anything. He also stated that his calls did not involve any requests for how to vote and answered no when asked if he discussed delaying or defeating the vote. The FD 302, moreover, indicates that Mr. Flynn denied that Kislyak described any Russian request to his response. After the interview, the FBI agents expressed uncertainty as to whether Mr. Flynn had lied. FBI agents reported to their leadership that Mr. Flynn exhibited a, quote, very sure demeanor and, quote, did not give any indicators of deception. Both of the agents, quote, had the impression at the time that Flynn was not lying or did not think he was lying. When Director Comey asked, based on his evaluation of the case, quote, do you believe that Mr. Flynn lied? Director Comey responded, quote, I don't know. I think there's an argument to be made he lied. It's a close one. Which is so much different than everything he said in public. On November 30th, 2017, the special counsel's office filed a criminal information against Mr. Flynn, charging him with a single count of making false statements in violation of 18 U.S.C. 1001. Mr. Flynn pled guilty to that offense, but moved to withdraw that guilty plea on January 14th, 2020. On January 29th, Mr. Flynn also filed a motion to dismiss the case for egregious government misconduct and in the interest of justice, and supplemented that motion based on additional disclosures. Both Mr. Flynn's motion to withdraw his guilty plea and motion to dismiss the case remain pending before the court. Legal background. This is going to go over why the DOJ has the right to remove or revoke drop the charges, basically. Here's a footnote. On May 7th, defense counsel confirmed with the prosecution team that upon the government filing of this motion to dismiss, the defense would move to withdraw all pending defense motions without prejudice. So the DOJ talked to Sidney Powell and General Flynn and said, if we drop these charges, will you remove your motions that you have pending? And they said they would. I didn't read this part yet. They're pleading for why the government should not why the court should not deny their motion to dismiss, and giving the case law to support that ruling. Based on an extensive review of this investigation, including newly discovered and disclosed information attached to the defendant's supplemental pleadings, the government has concluded that continued prosecution of Mr. Flynn would not serve the interest of justice. Under the principles of federal prosecution, the government should not prosecute a defendant unless the attorney for the government believes that the admissible evidence is sufficient to obtain and sustain a guilty verdict by an unbiased tier of fact. A determination to prosecute represents a policy judgment that the fundamental interests of society require the application of federal criminal law to a particular set of circumstances. The particular circumstances of this case militate in favor of terminating the proceedings. Mr. Flynn pleaded guilty to making false statements that were, quote, not material to any investigation because the government doesn't have a substantial federal interest in penalizing a defendant for a crime that is not satisfied occurred and that it does not believe it can prove beyond a reasonable doubt. The government now moves to dismiss the criminal information under Rule 48. Proof of a false statement to federal investigators requires more than a lie. It also, here we go, requires demonstrating that such a statement was material to the underlying investigation, of which the government has said they didn't have any basis for. Section 1001 prohibits knowing and willfully making any materially false, fictitious, or fraudulent statements or representation in a matter within the jurisdiction of the executive branch of government of the United States. As is well established, materiality does not equate to mere relevance. Rather, to be material means to have probative weight. That is, to be reasonably likely to influence the tribunal in making a determination required to be made. The materiality threshold thus ensures that misstatements to investigators are criminalized only when linked to the particular subject of their investigation. And General Flynn has just tweeted. We're going to look at that really quickly. So cute. This is Mike Flynn Jr.'s son. Oh, goodness. I love this family here.
To the flag, United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, of liberty and justice for all.
All right, buddy.
Oh my God, this family is just so freaking amazing. They still love this country. They still love this country. Sorry, I got a text with that in it. I want to listen to this again. Bear with me.
Allegiance to the flag, United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, of liberty and justice for all.
All right, buddy.
Allegiance
Yes.
to the flag.
All right. Back to the filing. Okay. The materiality threshold thus ensures that misstatements to investigators are criminalized only when linked to the particular subject of their investigation. False blah blah blah, and it prevents law enforcement from fishing for falsehoods merely to manufacture jurisdiction over any statement, true or false, uttered by a private citizen or public official. In the case of Mr. Flynn, the evidence shows his statements were not material to any viable counterintelligence investigation. Or any investigation, for that matter, initiated by the FBI. Indeed, the FBI itself had recognized that it lacked sufficient basis to sustain its initial counterintelligence investigation by seeking to close that very investigation without even an interview of Mr. Flynn. Having repeatedly found no derogatory information on Mr. Flynn, the FBI's draft closing communication made clear that the FBI had found no basis to predicate further investigative efforts into whether Mr. Flynn was being directed and controlled by a foreign power in a manner that threatened U.S. national security or violated FARA or its related statutes. With its counterintelligence investigation no longer justifiably predicated, the communications between Mr. Flynn and Mr. Kislyak, the FBI's sole basis for resurrecting the investigation on January 4th, did not warrant either continuing that existing counterintelligence investigation or opening a new criminal investigation. The calls were entirely appropriate on their face. Mr. Flynn has never disputed that the calls were made. Indeed, Mr. Flynn, as the former DIA, would have readily expected that the FBI had known of the calls. This is what we have been saying for years now. And it's coming out of our DOJ. And I'm going to go over at the end, hopefully with my wits about me, why this is so important. Mr. Flynn, as the former director of the DIA, would have readily expected that the FBI had known of the calls and told FBI Director McCabe as much. Mr. Flynn, as the incumbent national security advisor and senior member of the transition team, was reaching out to a Russian ambassador in that capacity. In the words of one senior DOJ official, quote, "It seemed logical that there may be some communications between an incoming administration and their foreign partners. Such calls are not uncommon when incumbent public officials preparing for their oncoming duties seek to begin and build relationships with soon-to-be counterparts." nor was anything said on the calls themselves to indicate an inappropriate relationship between Mr. Flynn and a foreign power. Indeed, Mr. Flynn's request that Russia avoid escalating tensions in response to U.S. sanctions in an effort to mollify geopolitical tensions was consistent with him advocating for, not against, the interests of the United States. At bottom, the arm's-length communications gave no indication that Mr. Flynn was being directed and controlled by the Russian Federation, much less in a matter that threatened national security. They provided no factual basis for positing that Mr. Flynn had violated FARA, nor did the calls remotely transform Mr. Flynn into a, quote, viable candidate as a part of the larger umbrella case into Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. In any event, there was no question at the FBI as to the content of the calls. The FBI had in its possession word-for-word transcripts of the actual communications between Mr. Flynn and Mr. Kislyak. With no dispute as to what in fact was said, there was no factual basis for the predication of a new counterintelligence investigation. Nor was there justification or need to interview Mr. Flynn as to his own personal recollections of what had been said. Whatever gaps in his memory Mr. Flynn may or may not reveal upon an interview regurgitating the content of those calls would not have implicated legitimate counterintelligence interests or somehow exposed Mr. Flynn as beholden to Russia. Notably, at this time, the FBI did not open a criminal investigation based on Mr. Flynn's calls with Mr. Kislyak, predicated on the Logan Act. The FBI never attempted to open a new investigation of Mr. Flynn on these grounds. Mr. Flynn's communications with the Russian ambassador implicated no crime. This is apparent from the FBI's rush to revive its old investigation rather than open and justify a new one, as well as its ongoing inability to espouse a consistent justification for its probe and conversations with DOJ leadership. My gosh, this is damning. This is damning and a very good sign for justice moving forward. In fact, Deputy Attorney General Yates thought that the FBI leadership, quote, morphed between describing the investigation into Mr. Flynn as a counterintelligence or a criminal investigation. In short, Mr. Flynn's calls with the Russian ambassador, the only new information to arise since the FBI's decision to close out the investigation, did not constitute an articulable factual basis to open any counterintelligence investigation or criminal investigation, i.e., they were in a frenzy to keep the original counterintelligence investigation open because they had no basis to open a new investigation, and they wanted to get this guy, this innocent man who served his country with distinction for decades, because they didn't like him and they knew that he was going to wreak havoc on their little club. Now, I'm going to read the footnote real quick. Congress first enacted the Logan Act in 1799. The Department of Justice does not appear ever to have brought a prosecution under the statute in 150 years. And the government's aware of only 2 indictments in 1803 and 1852, neither of which resulted in a conviction. In the absence of any history of enforcement or any public guidance concerning the scope of its prohibition, the department does not believe there was a legitimate basis to investigate and prosecute the designated NSA of the president-elect under the Logan Act for communicating with the foreign ambassador and seeking to mollify geopolitical tensions in advance of the inauguration of the next president. Mr. Strzok and Ms. Page apparently celebrated the, quote, serendipitous and amazing fact of the FBI's delay in formally closing out the original counterintelligence investigation. Having the ability to bootstrap the calls with Mr. Kislyak onto the existing authorization obviated the need for the 7th floor of the FBI to predicate further investigative efforts. In doing so, the FBI sidestepped a modest but critical protection that constrains the investigative reach of law enforcement, the predication threshold for investigating American citizens. Nor did anything about the statements by Vice President Pence or Sean Spicer in mid-January, weeks after the FBI had resolved to resurrect its dormant investigation into Mr. Flynn, provide a separate or distinct basis for an investigation. Had the FBI been deeply concerned about disparities between what they knew had been said on the calls and the representation of the vice president or Mr. Spicer, it would have sought to speak with them directly, but did not. Whether or not Mr. Flynn had been entirely candid with the future vice president or press secretary did not create a predicate for believing he had committed a crime or was beholden to a foreign power. The frail and shifting justifications for its ongoing probe of Mr. Flynn, as well as the irregular procedure that preceded his interview, suggests that the FBI was eager to interview Mr. Flynn irrespective of any underlying investigation. As is undisputed, the agents breached the common practice of arranging for the interview through the White House counsel. Deputy Director McCabe effectively discouraged Mr. Flynn from procuring counsel or even notifying the White House counsel. The interviewing agents failed to issue the common Section 1001 admonitions about lying to investigators. Nor did the FBI even notify Acting Attorney General Yates that the interview was happening until they were already en route to Mr. Flynn. This gambit by the FBI left Yates flabbergasted and dumbfounded. Additionally, prior to the interview, there were internal FBI discussions about whether to show Mr. Flynn the transcripts of his calls with Mr. Kislyak. In light of the fact that the FBI already had these transcripts in its possession, Mr. Flynn's answers would have shed no light on whether and what he communicated with Mr. Kislyak, i.e. there was really no reason for them to interview him at all. And those issues were immaterial to the no longer justifiably predicated counterintelligence investigation. Similarly, whether Mr. Flynn did or did not recall communications already known by the FBI was assuredly not material. Under these circumstances, the government cannot explain, much less prove to a jury beyond a reasonable doubt, how false statements are material to an investigation that, as explained above, seems to have been undertaken only to elicit those very false statements and thereby criminalize Mr. Flynn. Although it does not matter that the FBI knew the truth and therefore was not deceived by Mr. Flynn's statements, a false statement must still be capable of influencing an agency function or decision. Even if he told the truth, Mr. Flynn's statements could not have conceivably influenced an investigation that had neither a legitimate counterintelligence nor criminal purpose. Pre-Stap's talking points prepared in advance of a January 24th morning meeting with McCabe reflect this internal debate. Accordingly, a review of the facts and circumstances of this case, including newly discovered and disclosed information, indicates that Mr. Flynn's statements were never material to any FBI investigation. There is a footnote we will read. The statements by Mr. Flynn also were not material to the umbrella investigation of Crossfire Hurricane, which focused on the Trump campaign and its possible coordination with the Russian officials to interfere with the 2016 presidential election back prior to November 2016. Mr. Flynn had never been identified by that investigation and had been deemed no longer a viable candidate for it. Most importantly, his interview had nothing to do with this subject matter, and nothing in FBI materials suggests any relationship between the interview and the umbrella investigation. Rather, throughout the period before the interview, the FBI consistently justified the interview of Flynn based on its no longer justifiably predicated counterintelligence investigation of him alone. This is bad. And even if they could be material, the government does not believe it could prove that Mr. Flynn knowing and willfully made a false statement beyond a reasonable doubt. Based on the facts of this case, the government is not persuaded that it could show that Mr. Flynn committed a false statement under its burden of proof. The FBI agents had the impression that Flynn was not lying or did not think he was lying, and the statements in question were not by their nature easily falsifiable. In his interview, Mr. Flynn offered either equivocal or indirect responses or claimed to not remember the matter in question. The government appreciates that the court previously deemed Mr. Flynn's statements sufficiently material to the investigation. It did so, however, based on the government's prior understanding of the nature of the investigation, before new disclosures crystallized the lack of a legitimate investigative basis for the interview of Mr. Flynn, and in the context of a decision on multiple defense Brady motions independent of the government's assessment of its burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, i.e., Brendan Van Grack lied through his teeth, as did the special counsel. Combining the vague substance of the answers, the FBI's own preliminary estimation of Mr. Flynn's truthfulness, the inconsistent FBI records as to the actual questions and statements made, and Director Comey's own sentiment that the case was a close one, the evidentiary problems that have emerged create reasonable doubt as to whether Mr. Flynn knowingly and willingly lied to investigators during the interview. Mr. Flynn previously pleaded guilty to making false statements. In the government's assessment, however, he did so without full awareness of the circumstances of the newly discovered, disclosed, or declassified information as to the FBI's investigation of him. Mr. Flynn stipulated to the essential element of materiality without cause to dispute it, insofar as it concerned not his course of conduct, but rather that of the agency investigating him, and insofar as it has been further illuminated by new information in discovery. Federal prosecutors possess immense power to strike at citizens, not with mere individual strength, but with all of the force of government itself. For that reason, the citizen's safety lies in the prosecutor, who seeks truth and not victims, who serves the law and not factional purposes, and who approaches the task with humility, based on a careful assessment of the balance of proof, the equities, and the federal interests served by continued prosecution of false statements that were not material to any bona fide investigation. The government has concluded that the evidence is insufficient to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. The government therefore moves to dismiss the criminal information under Rule 48. So yes, I just read that entire document. Now, let's talk about some stuff. Let's take a look. Hold on a second. Bear with me, guys, and see what's going on in this case. Okay, so there's no new filings yet, but that's okay. All right. Now, what we're seeing, I want a couple things I want to say, okay? Number one, let me pull up I want everybody to stop giving these swamp rat traitors power. And how do you do that? You give them power when you care what the hell they say. Oh wait, there was just a docket alert in the case. Hold on, let me refresh this. Okay. Motion to dismiss, motion to withdraw. Hold on. Bear with me. I wonder if there is exhibits. Okay, so Michael Flynn's motion to withdraw pending motions. The Sidney Powell is withdrawing the motions pending before the court. Motion to withdraw the plea of guilty is requested to be withdrawn. Motion to dismiss for egregious government misconduct in the interest of justice. And also the motion to compel against Covington. Here is what we just read, but the exhibits are at the end. And here's why. You guys just hang with me for a second, because here we go. Okay, there's going to be stuff in here that we have not seen yet. So this is the first time I'm seeing this stuff, and then we'll get back to giving anybody power. I might be with you for another little bit. Okay. This is the closing document in the Crossfire Razor investigation. This is the document where the Crossfire Hurricane team says that there was nothing on General Flynn at all. He came back completely clean, squeaky as a whistle, and they request to close the investigation. This is the opening of the Crossfire Razor investigation, which we have not seen yet. So bear with me. I'm reading this for the very first time, and so are all of you guys, okay? The FBI is opening a full investigation based on an articulable factual basis that reasonably indicates that Crossfire Razor may wittingly or unwittingly be involved in activity on behalf of the Russian Federation, which may constitute a federal crime or threat to national security. It's being predicated on predetermined set criteria set forth by Crossfire Hurricane, based on an assessment of reliable lead information received during the course of the investigation. Specifically, he was cited as an advisor on foreign policy, ties to various state-affiliated entities of the Russian government, which he doesn't have, as reported by open source information. Listen, guys, as reported by open source information, literally the FBI just admitted to you, Peter Strzok and his ilk, that they used a report from some swampy, disgusting, traitorous reporter. I could literally write a report under what's happening right now. I could literally write a report and publish it on Uncover DC that says that James Comey is working as an agent of Russia, and that he needs to be investigated. And the reason why I say this is because I had a source that came to me and told me so. This is what they used. They used open source reporting from people that they laundered information through to report. This is so disgusting. The goal of the investigation is to determine whether the captioned subject associated with the Trump team is being directed and controlled or coordinating activities with the Russian Federation in a matter which may be a threat to national security. As the captioned subject is prominent in a domestic political campaign, they have categorized this as a sensitive investigative matter and considered the factors set forth. Based on this, the FBI believes that opening this investigation is the least intrusive method to address the national security risk. Here is a 302 of Mary McCord in front of the special counsel. I have not read any of this stuff yet, and it's probably not smart for me to read it online with you guys because it's going to take me a little while. We're in a live investigation now. A Tracy Bean's live investigation. All right, let's see. Who wants to go through this material live? Give me a number 1. If you want me to close this up and give you my opinion on some stuff, give me a number 2. I'll wait. One. Okay. I got a few ones. I got a bunch of ones. We'll do it. I just got to take a Tylenol. Bear with me a second. Let me get a sip of water, take a Tylenol, and we'll dive into 108 pages together, shall we? Something else. Anybody that says 2 can feel free to come back to this later or not at all, because there's a lot of ones. All right, my phone is blowing up. I've got tons of emails. Just bear with me a second. Okay. Here we go. I can't take Advil for several reasons. Okay, here we go. McCord took notes on a variety of things, given her responsibilities. On matters related to Russia, she took notes because it was complex and she wanted to remember the details. She took notes on the phone. She didn't use the same notebook every time. When she was almost about to leave, she went back to her various folders, pulled out materials related to Russia, and gave them to task guests to hold on to, assuming they may be needed at some point in the future. Interesting. After law school, she worked for Hogan, was at the Department of Treasury, joined the DC USAO, went to Japan, went to North Carolina, went back to DC. This was on 7/17/2017. McCord started at DOJ as the acting principal deputy assistant attorney general for the NSD. In August 2014, she became the principal deputy assistant attorney general, where she stayed until 2016. After Carlin left, she served as AAG for the NSD, and her last day at the DOJ was May 12th, 2017, and now she works at Georgetown University Law Center. During the time she served as the acting AAG, there was no principal deputy in place, so she performed the duties of both positions. which included assisting in running various components of the NSD, Office of Law and Policy, Counterintelligence and Export Control, CFIUS. Interesting, CFIUS. On occasion, McCord would attend DCs and PCs at the White House when Yates was unavailable. McCord first learned of the FBI's investigation into Michael Flynn on a phone call with Andrew McCabe on January 3rd. In that call, McCabe told McCord the FBI had been planning to close their investigation before discovering telephone calls with Kislyak. McCabe explained to McCord that an intelligence product was in the works to address the lack of Russian reaction to the sanctions. There was a lot of speculation regarding the minimal response from the Russians, which was not what was expected. So again, this right here proves that the Obama administration purposefully placed those sanctions to cause upheaval. What kind of a traitorous does something like this? While the draft product was in the review stage, calls between Kislyak and Flynn were discovered, leading two analysts to wonder if those calls were related to the lack of response. McCabe described to McCord the content of the calls based on what he had been told. This is on January 3rd. I need to get a piece of paper real quick. Gotta take notes, guys. This is how I do things. January 3rd, McCord talks to McCabe. Okay. Page 2 of her notes indicates that General Counsel at the Office of the DNI, Bob Litt, raised the issue of Logan Act violation. McCord was not familiar with that Logan Act at the time and made a note to herself to look it up later. Also on page 2, McCord noted mention of a referral and noted that ultimately no referral was required as the FBI maintained the information would not refer a matter to themselves. Her notes also indicate that at the time, the individuals at FBI and ODNI that were aware of the issue were Clapper, Litt, Baker, and Anderson. Clapper, Litt, Baker, and Anderson. McCord later learned, who I believe Trish Anderson is at Covington now, by the way. McCord later learned of the FBI's existing counterintelligence cases on George Papadopoulos, Carter Page, Paul Manafort, and Mike Flynn, which she initially understood were not criminal investigations. McCord later learned of the ongoing Manafort criminal investigation. In the immediate aftermath of learning of the Flynn calls, McCord was not thinking about a criminal investigation. It seemed logical to her that there may be some communications between an incoming administration, so the Logan Act seemed like a stretch. She described it as concerning, but with no particular urgency. McCord didn't think people were considering briefing the incoming admin. However, that changed when Pence went on Face the Nation and said things McCord knew to be untrue. Also, as time went on, Sean Spicer made comments about Flynn's actions she knew to be false. The urgency grew. On January 13th, the FBI provided a briefing to DOJ on the background of the Flynn investigation, as well as the other pending related FBI counterintelligence cases. Strzok, Priestap, Moyer were there. McCord, Toscas, Evans, and Tashina. The briefing consisted of the Crown material, Flynn, and the cases she had already been briefed on. This was the first time she heard about these cases in detail, though she was aware of the intelligence community assessment. Page 3 of her notes indicate President-elect Trump was not briefed on the existence of the investigations. McCord didn't recall what her notation of Flynn payment on page 4 of her notes referred to, but surmised it might be related to RT. Also on page 4, McCord made note of an Ignatius column on Flynn's call and a potential Logan Act violation. Ignatius. McCord recalled that she and others at the DOJ queried the FBI as to their investigative plan if the case ended up moving into criminal. Priestap relayed that a tasking to develop a plan had gone out. Most pressing, as NS advisor, need to advise what to do and how to discuss with the incoming. They weren't thinking of criminal statutes. Page 10 references a defensive briefing. Priestap had said a defensive briefing would be difficult given that it seems as though people in the White House are not being honest with one another. If Flynn was lying to people within the White House and is potentially compromised, the value of a briefing was questionable. McCord thought Priestap was likely thinking from a purely counterintelligence perspective, not criminal. She saw the transcripts of the Flynn calls, asked to see them after Pence's statements on Flynn. It's very interesting that all of this is precipitated by Pence going on Meet the Press, Face the Nation. McCord believes she probably had the transcripts by January 19th, possibly having come over Cyprinet from Strzok. After reading them, she felt they were worse than she initially thought. She noted that her recollection of them is that Flynn proactively raised the issue of sanctions, and she feels it's hard to believe he would forget talking about something he raised himself. Yates and Axelrod talk about what to do with the Flynn information, said someone should discuss it with McCabe. They were concerned because Pence had said something untrue to the American people, as though they'd always told the truth to the American people. Please give me a break. They were concerned because at this point, Pence had said something untrue and the Russians knew it was untrue. The implications of that were that the Russians believed either Vice President was in on it with Flynn. In on what? Hold on. Big problem here. The entire case was that General Flynn was working on behalf of the Russian government. He was a Russian asset. That's their entire theory, right? But here, Mary McCord is saying that the implications of Vice President Pence lying to the American people about the sanctions conversation is that the Russians believed one of two things. Either that the vice president was in on it with Flynn, or that Flynn was clearly willing to lie to the vice president. If he was working in cooperation with the Russian government at that time, that statement doesn't make any sense whatsoever. When McCord called McCabe, he told her that the FBI did not want to compromise their counterintelligence investigation, which was what would happen. So we had to hide it from the White House. Otherwise, they would know we were up to something. The FBI, McCabe tells her the FBI has no duty to notify, and they were worried it would look like a political stunt. Prior to the inauguration, they began going out to the IC on whether or not the incoming administration needed to know about Flynn and Kislyak. The DNI was that they were comfortable with the information being shared, but it was ultimately the FBI's decision. See, now here's the other thing. I'm not positive on this, but if this call, again, back to my transcript thing, if this call was being captured, there's more documents. If this call was being captured by the NSA, or it makes me wonder, in other words, if this is the FBI's decision, that means that the FBI was the one monitoring the call. I don't think that that's how it works. The FBI, I'm telling you, I bet you anything we're going to learn that there was a warrant that they were using to monitor the call with Kislyak, and that's why they had the transcript. And not because it was that they were monitoring Kislyak and they unmasked Flynn. Because this, if they're putting the decision for whether or not to talk to the White House or release the transcript to the White House or whatever in the hands of the FBI, that means that it's FBI property. It was an FBI gather, which to me doesn't lend itself to it being that they were monitoring Kislyak. I hope this makes sense. There was no obligation to notify Congress, and if they did, it should only be Gang of 8. Consulting pages 7 and 8 of her notes, McCord believed that Comey was visiting the ODNI on January 19th, and that the DOJ was still trying to drum up support to notify the White House of the calls. They knew about them. On a phone call with ODNI Lit and Brad Booker, it was relayed that the DNI agreed the information should be brought to the attention of the two, POTUS and Vice POTUS, but the primary equity was the FBI, so they should make the final call. This is exactly what happened. This was not an unmasking, in my opinion. I don't believe that this was an unmasking. I think the FBI had a warrant through the counterintelligence investigation, and that's how they got this information. They had a warrant. I don't know that it was a FISA warrant. It may have just been a regular warrant. There is a court case ongoing right now where the media is trying to get copies of the warrants. Yates and Axelrod. Oh, wait, hold on. McCord relayed that Yates wanted to be able to say Comey in a later conversation that the DNI agrees with the need to notify and asked Clapper if Brennan would call Comey. McCord was told Brennan may have been at ODNI at the same time as Comey, and someone would like to try to arrange for Comey and Clapper to talk. Later, McCord learned that Clapper and Comey talked, but Comey said he would not brief the White House. So we've got here Comey consistently pushing to keep this a big secret, and for some reason, these guys wanting him to tell the White House. Yates and Axelrod were increasingly frustrated with the FBI. One reason was that their perception, the FBI's perspective on the matter, morphed. Initially, their resistance was attributed to the desire to protect the FBI's investigation, but later, Comey said he was concerned about compromising a criminal investigation. McCord was not sure when the discussion about the criminal investigation occurred, but said it definitely happened by the week after the inauguration. McCord pushed back on Andy McCabe about the unwillingness to notify the White House and asked him about the FBI's plan and raised the fact that the DNI and CIA concurred with the need to notify. This is everybody flipping on each other. There are no mods. I'm trying to do it myself, guys. Sorry. People just can't behave themselves. I'm a one-woman show. There's a one-woman show here. On January 23rd, McCord, Yates, Axelrod, and Guahar had a discussion about the Flynn matter and reinforced their collective position that the White House should be notified. On January 24th, she held a meeting in her conference room where she said she was going to tell Comey to tell the White House counsel about the Flynn Kislyak call. It was an FBI responsibility. The group was flabbergasted. They sent agents to interview Flynn. Following the interview, the DOJ attendees were Axelrod, Crowell, Toscas, Evans, and Schools. The FBI's rationale for doing the interview was that the existence of the investigation had already leaked, so Flynn was already aware the information was being discussed publicly and there was no element of surprise. Precept told the group the goal of the interview was to determine whether or not Flynn was in a clandestine relationship with the Russians. They did not want to insinuate the existence of a criminal investigation, so they didn't give a warning. Toscas raised the issue of the lack of warning since he and others thought that he had lied. God, this is going to be a lot to read with you guys on a live stream. Let me just scan this real quick. See, they blank it out. McGann asks Yates how she knows about the calls with Kislyak, and she explained that redacted. Okay, this is what I'm going to do. I can't go through 108 pages with you guys, sadly. It's just going to be too much time, and I have to use the ladies' room. So this is all McCord's 302. Let's just see what else is in here. This is a lot of information. Hold on. Exhibit 4. Yates 302. She learned about the call in the White House meeting right before she wrote herself that email. Oh boy, this is something Obama mentioned all throughout here. Oh gosh, I can't wait to read all this. Okay, I need to go. I'll do a thread on Twitter about this. There's a Yates 302 that we have never seen before, in my opinion. I don't believe we've ever seen this before. There is also a very long Yates 302. There's other filings too. We'll take a look at. Exhibit 5 is a HIPSI. I think that this is Comey or McCabe. I'm just looking through this real quick. Bear with me, guys. It was Comey. Yeah. Okay, so here's Mr. Comey. This is a transcript of James Comey's interview on March 2nd, 2017 in front of the HIPSI. A lot of this is redacted. It's all about General Flynn. Exhibit 6 is Peter Strzok's 302. This is going to be interesting. It's unredacted, basically in total. Exhibit 7 are more text messages. I believe we got these. I believe this agent that's blacked out is Pienka. Here's some emails. The Logan Act. 9 is something we've seen already. There's more people we haven't learned about, by the way, in here. Typhoon was Papadopoulos. The questions we went over, we saw that. 10. The handwritten notes from pre-step we saw. Here is a memo between, oh boy. This is, I believe, a memo of the call between McCabe and Flynn. Here's more handwritten notes. I haven't seen yet. This is notes from 302. This is notes from the 302. This is a lot of work to go through, guys. It's going to be a lot of work. Exhibit 13 is another 302 from Peter Strzok, which is, wow, very much redacted. And that's that. Let's look again. Motion to dismiss. That's it. That's all we got so far. Okay. So let's quickly talk before I go about why it doesn't matter. Why it doesn't matter what the media is saying and what the media is saying about and what these lefty check marks are saying about this decision. They have as much power as we give them, okay? This is Ted Lieu. The Justice Department filing does not show Michael Flynn is innocent. He still lied to the FBI, a felony. He still violated FARA, a federal offense. AG Bill Barr made a transparently political decision that further shreds the credibility of the Justice Department. See, they're all freaking out about this. They didn't read any of it. They're wrong. All of them are wrong. They're butthurt. They're wrong. They're traitors. They're complicit. They should all be held responsible. Ignore them. They have all the power that you give them, and that's it. They're wrong. I mean, it's literally all lies. They're still lying to people. They know they're lying to people. There is no way you can study this case and come to any other conclusion than the Justice Department just came to. Okay? Reading these today is going to be sweet, sweet justice for me. I'm going to go through all of these declarations and I'm going to laugh. I'm going to laugh. Because this is the beginning of the end for these people. And no matter how much they cry and scream and stamp their feet, it isn't going to matter. And we're going to see handcuffs coming out very soon. Mark my words. Mark my words. You could show these guys, like you could put down a piece of paper in front of them with a handwritten confession from somebody. And they would still say that it was wrong and that the DOJ used the wrong kind of paper and that, for goodness sakes, again, they only have as much power as you give them. So if the legacy media is out there saying, oh, this is a travesty of justice, who cares? Let them cry. They're on the wrong side of history. They're the most disgusting propagandists, traitors to this country that I've ever seen in my entire life. They have no hearts. They have no souls. They are empty, disgusting human beings. They have nothing better to do. They're done. They're over. They lost. They're losing. Also, please, if you're going to talk to me about this, do not say to me, the DOJ should have waited until the judge made a decision. Because now the media is using it to attack Barr. Who cares? Who cares what the media say? Guess who's making decisions? It's not the media. These people are not the ones making decisions. They look like morons to anyone with a brain inside their heads, okay? These people were actively participating in an ongoing coup against a sitting president. They continue to this day to lie to the American people to suit their own personal end goal. They think they know better than you. They think they know better than you what you need and what you want. They think that the government should be all powerful and have all the reins over the American people. These people are traitors to this country. There is no other way to describe them, and they must be deemed irrelevant from this point forward. And that's it. I am overflowing with hope today because justice has been done. And the Justice Department took its own and slammed it in that filing. They know that there was malfeasance. They know that people were targeted. They know what happened. And they just spelled it out in black and white in a court filing, asking to dismiss a case that they brought based on absolutely nothing. Don't let these sanctimonious, pig-headed traitors get under your skin. Just smile at them and know that good always wins in the end. I have a lot of very big news coming about some things that I'm doing that will benefit all of you greatly. And I'm very excited about them. A lot of things going on. If you guys appreciate the work I do and you'd like to become a patron, it's what keeps me going. You can find me on Patreon at patreon.com/TracyBeans with a Z. You can find my PayPal account in the description box below. Thank you to everybody that has signed up to be a patron. You can go to Subscribestar if you don't like Patreon. Also, uncoverdc.com. Real journalism, actual journalism. Please go there, subscribe to the mailing list. We only mail if there's new content on the site, and it's only once a day. There's no spamming of the inbox. It'll give you a list of everything that we've done for the day. We're growing, expanding. We're going to continue doing so that everybody has a place that they can go where they can actually trust the information that they're getting to be the truth, for goodness sakes. I will accept nothing less, and neither should any of you. You stuck by General Flynn, you kept making noise, and you're a big reason why we've gotten to this point today. God bless all of you guys, and thank you so much. I will talk to you very soon.